I'm excited to welcome Jairus for his presentation, Between Oblivion and Forever, a Critique of Nuclear Reason. And for those of you who don't know, Jairus is an associate professor of international relations in our own political science department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He is also the director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies and the current graduate chair in our department, which means Jairus is a man of many hats and skills. According to our website, his work thus far has centered on the ecology of future or of global warfare. He's also interested in various approaches to global relations, such as systems theory, cybernetics, and complexity theory, as well as the role new media play in altering the interface with global relations. See, I have a lot to learn from Jairus today. He is the author of Savage Ecology, War and Geopolitics in the End of the World, which was published in 2019 by Duke University Press. Those who know Jairus personally know that he's more than just a typical academic. He is a collector of vinyl, a musician, but what impresses me most about Jairus is how he has spent some of his precious COVID lockdown time building his own electric guitar with one of our other colleagues. So with that said, we can't hear or see you, but feel free to give Jairus a round of applause as I pass it over to Jairus. Mahalo.
Awesome. Thank you, Aioli. And I also want to thank Malia Hulaman, who made this amazing poster for this talk. That was a nice surprise. You know, it can be a bit impersonal doing these things, talking to a camera, but that, I don't know, it made it extra fun. So I'm going to figure out how to start share. And let's see. Give me 1 second. Awesome. Okay, so we're there. All right. To give a little bit of background, this is a talk based on a very, very recent project. It just got started within the last year and is in large part, you know, I thought I would say a bit about the decision making about it. The result of deciding not to write another book, not permanently, but because COVID life is super insane and it's really hard to think about getting anything done when you're taking care of family and chasing kids and trying to make Zoom school work in 4 different rooms and chasing animals around and just dealing with the overall anxiety and stress of living during a pandemic in which our governments are mostly failing us rather than reassuring us. And so a project that I was like 2 years into, I'd spent a ton of time doing archival work. The idea of trying to jump back into it after basically 6 months of prioritizing things like making sure, you know, our grad students had the stuff they needed to stay in school and fighting with, you know, the administration, the governor over trying to close down all our departments if they had anything to do with anything politically interesting, and making sure that we saw the last fascists out of office. It was hard to think about jumping back into a project that was so big. You know, it's a particularly big book. And so instead, I decided to put that one on pause and start this with my friend Antoine Bosquet, who I'd written with before. And there was something, I think, quite lovely about co-writing something, particularly with someone who I knew well, who I trusted, who I didn't have to worry was going to, you know, send me 12 guilt trip emails in a row when I had to cancel something. You know, he's got kids too. His partner also works. You know, we're trying to write this project in some ways like in the rhythm of life that has been created by COVID. And so that's actually been really nice. And I sort of encourage people, you know, if you've put something on hold or you think that something seems totally overwhelming, then, you know, in the words of Brian, you know, try something totally different. And that's what this is. It actually, the inkling or the idea of it happened in 2 places simultaneously at 2 different times. The first sort of version of it happened second and was in a bar in Prague in November of 2018, about 2 o'clock in the morning. Antoine and I were having beers with a fellow panelist from the event that we were at, on sort of NATO and insecurity. And his name was Matt Kronig. He was from Georgetown University, and he was a totally nice guy. And the news flash to that was he was a totally nice guy that was explaining to us that after working for Obama, he had started working for Trump and was trying to argue in favor of massive nuclear modernization and a shift in US nuclear policy from one of, at least publicly speaking, deterrence to one of, basically overkill, the ability to destroy all other competitors with a first strike that would be unquestionable. And this was a profoundly bizarre moment. Sitting around in this beautiful city after having a really exciting day, and having a couple of beers and dinner with somebody who seemed, in some sense, just like us, right? We talked about kids, we talked about schools, we talked about jet lag and balancing life, and then transitioned immediately to global thermal nuclear war. And I found that fascinating. The idea that I could kind of see someone in person who had the zeal for nuclear weapons of a Herman Kahn or a John Von Neumann, and them not at first grasp seem obviously like a psychopath, was important to me, right? It suggested to me that that there was something about nuclear reason which could become a form of common sense to the point at which it was as casual an opinion or theoretical position on whether or not you think post-colonial or decolonial is the better way to describe the condition of politics after 1945. And I think Antoine had a very similar experience. I won't speak for him, but likewise, like it was bizarre. And one of the conversations that had actually gotten us started on this path, which led us to understand just like how different we were in our thinking about the world, was I had an event just a few months before the same year in which I became very interested in nuclear weapons again, because I was on a bathroom floor with my partner and kids wondering how much longer it would be until a nuclear missile supposedly inbound from North Korea was going to strike Honolulu. And I have to say, like, that was a profoundly altering experience for a couple of reasons. One is that it took this incredibly abstract knowledge that I had of nuclear war, nuclear weapons from graduate school, and thinking about nuclear strategy and all of these ways in which, I commonly talked about nuclear accidents as a reason not to have nuclear weapons. But somehow there was still a disconnect between that logical knowledge and any sense that there could be a possibility that I would actually face the consequences of those ideas. And even though the nuclear bomb never fell, I promise you the affective and psychic fallout was real. And it changed experientially how I thought about kind of the nuclear world we live in. And is in a large part why I've come to think more seriously about what it is that makes nuclear weapons increasingly a non-issue. And that's part of what I'm going to try to talk about today. And I think part of the project, which is how did nuclear weapons become something totally normal, more importantly, reasonable via something like rationality? And how did that thinking become so divorced from the, obviously what seems like to any sort of average person, totally insane decisions about whether or not to destroy the entire planet in the pursuit of supposedly victory in nuclear war. So that's sort of the big background behind why we got interested in the project. And the second part was that Antoine and I were then asked, after having this conversation with Kronig, where we basically said, wow, you are totally insane, right? Like you think you can control these weapons in a way that just boggles the mind. And yet, after telling him we thought he was totally insane, in a very academic and jovial way, he invited us to be part of a roundtable to review his book, of which he knew the answer was going to be that we thought he was totally insane. And so Antoine and I got started and really realized that something really weird happened in international relations somewhere around the late 80s, basically at the end of the Cold War, where people just sort of pretended that nuclear weapons disappeared, that they weren't significant anymore, even though the numbers were still increasing. And that further, we hadn't really taken seriously nuclear thinking as a kind of philosophy. And I think that's where the project really starts. And it starts with one of my favorite hobby horses, which is trying to prove that Albert Einstein is wrong about everything. And it's this quote that Einstein's quite famous for, that the release of atomic power has changed everything except our way of thinking. And I think if we were to sort of think about this book project in a nutshell, it's to say exactly the opposite. It's to say that the event of atomic power was actually a kind of watershed moment philosophically in the way in which a particular vanguard group of scientists and then strategists and then increasingly politicians thought about the capacity and agency of particular humans, mostly amongst great power states, to alter the conditions of the planet rather than a particular community or a nation state. And more to the point, to think about warfare as a permanent decision in something like the future of life, right? And that was a radical break, and that break brings along with it a number of different ways of thinking about core conceptions of things like the nature of humans, whether or not they can change or not change, how much power we have, and what the limits of that power are, both geographically in terms of whether or not it would remain planetary or become cosmic, which will become a big part of this talk, as well as the capacity or character to which humans could potentially control the very fabric of reality, meaning to control energy, to sustain energy at the level of the atom, suggested the increasing capacity to have authority and capability running below the subatomic scale. So to give a little background, we want to show that there's this sort of dramatic change in thinking that happens concomitant with the capacity of nuclear power. But there's also this sort of contemporary character, right? So we want to tell that history alongside the fact that we're experiencing something that a lot of people have called a nuclear renaissance. One of the major claims sort of in favor of this nuclear renaissance is that there are missing rungs in the so-called escalation ladder, that we got, particularly the United States, became complacent after the Cold War and stopped developing new classes of nuclear weapons, and that our competitors somehow have filled in those rungs in ways which would compel us, according to sort of the way escalation theory works, either to over or under respond. Meaning that if one of our competitors used one of these sort of mid-level, like not a Cadillac instead of Buick, for those of you who are too old, not a Honda instead of Hyundai, size nuclear weapon, that the United States would be put into this sort of trap logically of either having to only respond with conventional weapons, non-nuclear devices, or over-respond with strategic scale nuclear weapons, which would escalate a war further beyond any possibility of escalation dominance, meaning it would cause the war to get bigger rather than using a big, explosion to try to make the world smaller. And this is part of the reason why there's been so much interest, certainly during the Bush administration and in the Trump administration, and in the revisions of kind of nuclear modernization under Trump that took place in his proposal for nuclear strategy, to build what were considered more usable weapons, right? So weapons which could be used in theater, so in a particular region, as opposed to at the planetary scale. This is mostly due to the Baltics, and I won't get into that too much, but because of the way in which NATO forces think about themselves in a sort of permanent standoff over the Baltics with Russia, and other potential scenarios where Russia has been seen expanding into Crimea and Georgia and the Ukraine. So that's part of that story. But it means that there is more interest now than certainly maybe the last decade in trying to build new classes of nuclear weapons rather than just maintain the nuclear weapons we have. Part of that story too is paranoia over the capacity of Russia to develop so-called hypersonic weapons. These would be missiles that would move much too fast for even our most sophisticated forms of anti-missile defense, It would allow for very rapid strikes, which, potentially could prevent counterstrikes, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, they've got something that goes faster than we do. We need something that goes faster than they do. And the other is technological breakthroughs. And I think this one is particularly interesting in the case of Hawaii, because a lot of that has to do with missile defense. And so the supposedly successful efforts to shoot down missiles while they're in flight, which has been accomplished 3 times now, at least publicly, means that there's the capability potentially for the United States to use nuclear weapons without fear of retribution. And I think that is also a kind of, shot in the arm. And the last one is kind of what all these amount to, which is this return of a concept from Thomas Schelling's Arms and Influence of compellence, meaning the capability not to deter another competitor, meaning that you would scare them into not doing something, but to have so much capability, so much force, to be so impenetrable that we could command, sort of like chalk in hand, what other states should do, and they would merely do it. So not to prevent negative behavior that we didn't want, but to be able to compel affirmative behavior that we did want. And this was the thing that sort of, I think, to put it mildly, scared the shit out of Antoine and I the most. The idea that people were returning to an era in which they thought that nuclear offensive capabilities rather than defensive capabilities were something in reach, and that they should reorganize American force structure around that capability. Now, the irony is that while it scared us a lot, it had been tried before pretty recently. So the George W. Bush administration had similarly gone through a pretty major renovation of nuclear weapons against congressional authorities. So Congress had denied it. And Bush, despite being not one of the great environmental presidents, had taken a note from the Greens and decided to reduce, reuse, and recycle. And so he took all of the nuclear weapons which had been dismantled as a result of the START treaties with Russia and began redeploying the warheads and using the pieces to basically modify existing nuclear weapons to make them better at first strikes. Things like, ground burst potential, adding multiple warheads to missiles that were on submarines, and doing a number of other things. And so this has been tried, but I think in some sense, it didn't really ever reach expectations. And it seemed like now these expectations were returning, so much so that people were running around talking about how much they missed Herman Kahn and others who had thought we could manage the world with nuclear weapons. Now, this is all happening at a very strange time, because I think it's not just in IR. In general, I would say we're in a period of relative nuclear indifference. So if you don't live in Hawaii and you didn't spend 30 minutes wondering if a nuclear weapon was going to strike the island, you probably don't care very much about nuclear weapons. So while it's true that the UN recently organized a sort of global ban on nuclear weapons, none of the major nuclear weapon states participated. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is in shambles. Most of the norms aren't held to. Nuclear states intimidate non-nuclear states all the time with their nuclear weapons. We even threaten to use them. There's increasing testing happening around the planet. Trump wanted to start testing again, and so people who sort of trusted the United States would adhere to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but hadn't actually entered into it, are now in sort of more doubtful. And yet it's not newsworthy. And to me, this is sort of interesting, because while I think climate change is obviously incredibly important, everything we're concerned about from climate change, the atmosphere becoming hostile to plant life and basic cycles of water and weather patterns that we need for food and habitability, right? These can change in a matter of hours as a result of nuclear war. And we're probably still, sadly, 50 years out from those kinds of changes from carbon. It's also the case that nuclear war could cause rapid cooling, right? Where we could actually end up in a planet so cold that we would not have enough sunlight as a result of all the nuclear dust and catastrophe to grow food or even to live in many parts of the planet. So, nuclear weapons have the same kind of global character. And in some ways, are much more in our reach politically in terms of agency, right? We're talking about a handful of states that have nuclear weapons, and an even smaller number of states that have enough nuclear weapons to really destroy the planet, as compared to the global cooperation that we need for doing something about carbon emissions. And there is no contemporary nuclear equivalent of the Kyoto Accords. So it's great that Biden wants to get back on board the security on the Kyoto Accords, but we don't hear him talking about trying to revamp and do something as dramatic with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think part of that is the very discourse and organization that nuclear weapons are premised on. And they're premised on a series of stories we tell each other about necessary evils and regrettable sacrifices, which is to say that we characterize nuclear weapons as something tragic. And what helps with this, and I'll get into this more at the end of the talk, but a number of the key players, right? So think about Einstein. The rest of the quote I didn't read after he says that nuclear power changed the whole world, but it didn't change thought, is that he wishes sometimes he had just been a clockmaker, as if had he not done the work in physics he had done, then nuclear weapons would have never existed. We have similar comments from Oppenheimer. We have a number of people who worked on the Manhattan Project who recanted their involvement, and even a number of nuclear strategists who, once nuclear weapons became a global reach problem, thought they were just unmanageable. But that now that we had them, now that the so-called genie was out of the bottle, we are stuck with them. And the second sort of correlate to that is regrettable sacrifices. That nuclear weapons, for all of their evils, that they're actually not weapons, right? That they somehow are part of maintaining global order. And those who have been at the wrong end of them are simply the regrettable sacrifices of having an international order that hasn't had another world war since the Second World War. Now, of course, a large part of that discourse is the ability to write off entirely the numbers of people who died near testing, particularly Western Shoshone, many of the downwinders who lived in Nevada and New Mexico, certainly Pacific Islanders, potentially all over the Pacific. And I think the efforts to try to minimize what happened at various atoll testing sites, particularly in the Marshall Islands, and how widespread the damage was. These things have all been kind of written off, even though, by some estimates, the sort of nuclear radiation induced cancer deaths are upwards of 500,000. Some people think that they're much higher than that. Those are the sort of conservative estimates. But that's the discourse. The discourse is, we don't really want these weapons. We're sort of stewards for these weapons, and we will continue to be stewards because somehow that's just the cost of doing business. On the other side, and this is one of the other reasons why I got really interested in the project, we have emerging something quite different, which is a new nuclear sacred, which is not a sort of apology for the weapons to maintain them, but actually a championing of the weapons. So on the left, we have a priest from the Eastern Orthodox Church who's blessing one of the new nuclear weapons in Russia. This has actually become quite common. And the nuclear weapon has become a sacred symbol of what's often called Eurasianism, which is a kind of philosophy of Russian expansion through Europe and Asia. And on the right, we have some really devoted folks probably doing a sword drill with their Bible at one of the new American patriot churches, which explicitly identify with new American nationalism, white supremacy, and as a result, champion the United States becoming superior in nuclear technology, right? They're unsatisfied with the idea of mutually assured destruction or deterrence. And part of the project is to show that these new movements are actually not new at all. That underlying the very logic and the emergence of nuclear weapons was not a rationalist enterprise. We have the famous quote from Robert Oppenheimer, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This idea that something about nuclear capacity meant the emergence of a new kind of human, one that was in some sense superior to every human that came before them. And as I will get into specifically, that the kinds of humans that could develop the bombs, in the case of the United States, mostly, actually weirdly, mostly Polish immigrants, but or Hungarian immigrants rather, but also what we would think of as white Americans, white American men. In the Russian case, it'll be a little bit more different, but we'll get into that. And this, I think, this idea that the nuclear weapons are actually desirable, that we want more of them, that they're meant to transform the world and change the world, really, and this is part of the motivation for the book, comes against the tradition of talking about nuclear weapons in international relations. In international relations, nuclear weapons were the ultimate seduction of rationalism and behavioralism, in part because they were easy to count, because it was mostly the United States and Russia that were facing off against them, and that all of the decision-making could be represented in terms of things like game theory, rational choice. And so what we're trying to show in the book is actually that there's something much more like a kind of cosmology that runs against these rational conceits. And here are the major conceits that we're trying to show may exist in the academy, but actually don't exist amongst those who build and potentially use the weapons. The first is that nuclear weapons are primarily meant for deterrence. One of the things that we want to talk about, particularly in the early generations of Russian and American nuclear scientists and nuclear strategists, is that nuclear weapons were meant to do exactly the opposite. They were meant for victory, but victory at a cost, and that cost was something that actually could be a good thing. And I'll talk about the so-called win-win of nuclear war when we talk about James Conant. The second was that nuclear weapons were meant to create order, and that order is the overarching shared value of great powers. And I think this actually is the conceit that holds together ideas like game theory, that you could think about rational choice decisions between states about whether or not they would use or not use nuclear weapons based on the relative gains or losses in that decision. And again, this is actually something that runs contrary to the cosmologies of both Russian and American nuclear scientists and nuclear strategists, who often saw nuclear war as a transformative potential, the ability to create new orders through use, not to maintain order through non-use. And last, and this one I think is really important, that rationality as self-preservation, sort of one of the central conceits of political realism, makes the world predictable and safe. Or what Anton has been calling the providence of reason, that international relations and the international system somehow has guardrails, that don't worry, it won't get too crazy. And I think, if the fact that people can still believe that now, knowing that in many cases, Trump just wanted to know if he could use a nuclear weapon for fun, maybe blow up a hurricane, maybe use one against Iran, or maybe just test one, should call into question just how much the guardrails exist. The fact that it didn't happen, but it could happen, is, I think, something worth taking seriously. And this is the reason why I am particularly interested in returning to the concept of cosmology. I think unless we take seriously that there is a radically different cosmology, or not just a radically different way of thinking, but a radically different way of thinking about the human's place in the cosmos at the heart of the advent of nuclear weapons and the refining of nuclear weapons and their deployment, then we can kind of lull ourselves into a false sense of security that nuclear weapons and their use is governed by rationality. But if there is instead the possibility of another kind of reason in which nuclear weapons and their use, even their catastrophic use, would be desirable, I think we have to ask different kinds of questions. So why a word like cosmology? A friend of mine on Facebook was like, oh gosh, why would you talk about the cosmology of a bunch of dead white men? And that's a reasonable question. And the first reason is because the term fits. The kinds of ideas and theories we're trying to reconstruct from these early nuclear thinkers are origin stories, not of where humanity came from, but they are origin stories about the future of humanity and humanity's place in it. So they are an effort to give an account of the meaning of what it is to be human, how the human, or potentially the thing that inherits humanity, fits into the cosmos, and what that means in a larger metaphysical sense beyond sort of rational questions of, sort of sustaining itself. The second is that I think cosmology also brings in stark relief how much secularism and rationality are a kind of opiate to nuclear sort of discourse. right? That we live in a world where we presume that people wouldn't want to use nuclear weapons just to see what happens, or for victory at all costs, or, as I'll talk about later, to actually jumpstart and change the course of human evolution through purposeful mutation. That we can leave out ideas, quote unquote, that crazy, is to ignore the fact that at the original Los Alamos testing grounds, many of the scientists were on the other side of the bet of whether or not a nuclear weapon would ignite the entire atmosphere of the world, right? That the entire planet would be engulfed in flames by a single chain reaction, or whether or not there was a real probability that that chain reaction would extend into outer space and would just continue until it ran out of matter. And the other is that, and I think this is a central part for Antoine and I, that we want to take it seriously as a philosophical form of thought. One of the problems, I think, of philosophy, particularly the Western canon of philosophy, is to only want to take account of philosophical systems that are defensible or that they're desirable. There's a kind of normative bias, as opposed to thinking that instead of nuclear advocates being totally insane, even if it appears that way to us, they are internally consistent, meaning they have a logical system that is assumed in their view of the cosmos, in their view of value and human existence within that cosmos, which all fits together into a logic for nuclear use. And I think that until we can take that seriously as a form of thought, then critiquing it is nearly impossible, because we dismiss exactly how horrifying it can be, but also that it's a kind of project. It's not just a mistake. It's not just an aberration. It is actually a cosmological movement for changing the course of the planet and its future. And because we think that this cosmology violently shapes planetary politics, that at its base, nuclear weapons development and nuclear weapons maintaining is not for the limited rational purposes that many maintain, but that actually for many, it holds the possibility of transformation. So now I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes or so sort of making some of the cases for that, some of the places where we don't see the traditional rationalist claims on behalf of nuclear weapons, but we see the beginnings of a full cosmology in favor of nuclear weapon virtue rather than as a necessary evil. And it's hard not to start with Werner Von Braun, former Nazi scientist who was involved in the V2 rocket and the early rocket development in Germany, and was given a pass on his involvement in the Nazi military and government to come and work on the US space program and nuclear program. What's interesting about Von Braun is that Von Braun is often remembered as being one of these people who inspired this idea that humans should be amongst the stars, that they should be going forth. And we often forget not only his Nazi past, but certainly the fact that nuclear weapons were precisely the ships that we would ride to go there. And so while the sort of rationalization is, oh, well, Von Braun, according to him, didn't care where the rockets come down. He said, that's not my department. That he merely wanted to work on nuclear weapons because it was in some way a kind of instrumental way to develop the necessities for going to outer space, to truly emancipate humans. And so we should give him a kind of pass. But it's actually much more interesting than that. Von Braun wasn't worried about nuclear weapons. In fact, he found them quite desirable because he bought into a cosmology and a metaphysics that did not believe that the world could be destroyed. So to quote Von Braun, science, for instance, tells us that nothing in nature, not even the tiniest particle, can disappear without trace. This is his background in quantum physics. Think about that for a moment. Once you do, your thoughts about life will never be the same. Science has found that nothing can disappear without a trace. Nature does not know extinction. All it knows is transformation. Now, if God applies this fundamental principle to the most minute and insignificant part of his universe, doesn't it make sense to assume that he applies it also to the masterpiece of his creation, the human soul? I think it does. And everything science has taught me and continues to teach me strengthens my belief in the continuity of our spiritual existence after death. Nothing disappears without a trace. What's so important to me about this quote, it was an interview sort of late in Von Braun's life, is that it deconstructs that very dichotomy for which much of statecraft and sort of instrumental policy rationality is based on, which is the idea that somehow secularism, or a belief in the here and now, and sort of the finitude of things, limits the capabilities of logic and reason, right? That only the empirical. But what's happening here is not the rejection of that in favor of a kind of transcendent spirituality. It's an immanent spirituality. He is grounding in physics the incapability of destroying the planet, the immortality of life, and therefore making a claim about a kind of trans-historical and cosmological value for transformation. Now, what that means for what he thinks about nuclear weapons is really important, because it means that he's not worried about whether or not there'll be a nuclear war in the pursuit of outer space and expansion, precisely because that gamble will always pay off in terms of transformation, that there is nothing that can be destroyed. There will always be something, a trace, which will return or continue. That's very different than the way in which, say, for instance, in sort of classical rational choice theory or game theory, one of each unit would have to be constrained by the same value for there to be some prediction. And that value is always the fear of dying or the fear of being destroyed. But we have in one of the sort of makers of the nuclear world, the assumption that nothing can be destroyed. And in fact, the sort of highest good or the highest value is seeking out transformation. But von Braun wasn't alone, right? So a lot of people write von Braun off because, hey, he was the Nazi in the bunch. Sure, they tolerated him, but maybe he was crazy. But the reality is that most of the other thinkers had different versions of this. So John Von Neumann, who was one of the also not just scientists that helped develop the bomb, but also one of the key participants in developing nuclear strategy, developed the ideas of autopoiesis, or the fact that there's sort of a self-replicating automation to the emergence of life. He was also incredibly interested in the ways in which radiation would alter or mutate human DNA to produce different forms of life, and what kind of life that would emerge from that kind of situation. And I think that similarly, right, even though we don't have as explicit an appeal to spirituality, that is still a kind of immanentizing, right, making immanent the transcendent, right? That there's something in the very nature of matter itself that it's unkillable and will always reemerge. In Herman Kahn, we don't have quite the same argument about autopoiesis, but as a futurist, he was quite held on the idea that nuclear weapons were moral because they allowed for the capacity to build worlds and institutions, and that life was incredibly resilient. He even believed we could live in an ozoneless world. So even if nuclear weapons destroyed the ozone layer and UV light somehow sterilized the planet of plants and life, humans would be able to rebound. And his work at the Rand Institute and Hudson Institute underlied a lot of the nuclear game theory and nuclear scenarios which had come to pass. Edward Teller famously not only thought that nuclear weapons were sort of cosmologically useful, but were practically useful, and argued in favor of using nuclear weapons to build a port to increase US naval capacity in Alaska. He wanted to blow up a sizable chunk of Alaska using 3 strategic level nuclear bombs, and in it build a new naval base. He was also one of the core architects behind SDI and the thought that we could use outer space as a way to manage the nuclear environment so that nuclear weapons in the United States could continue to proliferate without fear of retaliation from our enemies. In all of these thinkers, what's clear is that a premise about the creativity of life, or the sort of immortality of life itself, enters into thinking about a kind of cosmic eugenics. Now, I think one of the sort of general responses to that is, well, I guess that's pretty crazy, but at least it's at the scale of humanity. At least it's thought of in some sense as universal, right? That life is in those things. But the next person I'm going to talk about, who I think taints the others, although I'll have to make a better case for that later, but I want us to think about, really gives character to that eugenics in a way which I think is also implied in the nationalism of all of these thinkers, right? They wanted the United States to win. And that's James Kahn. James Conant, who was part of the Manhattan Project and helped plan the attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, he was one of the major advocates of hitting a civilian industrial site because he believed that nuclear strategy would be most effective if it targeted cities and quote unquote how high value targets rather than what would be considered as strategic targets, meaning military targets. So rather than removing the capacity of a state's ability to have a war against you, Conant believed that we should have counter value targeting, meaning we should hit cities and economic regions. Dean McCannell, who's actually a comparative literature scholar, has done some amazing work to look at the rest of James Conant's career, which we often don't think about. So we hear the stories about how James Conant was this sort of, one of the brilliant minds behind the decision to drop the bomb and the strategic value of nuclear weapons more generally, and the way in which targeting industrial centers and cities could be sort of core to the capacity of the United States to win a nuclear war through a series of balancing and then improvements. What we don't talk about very much is James Conant, the educational theorist. So James Conant was the president of Harvard, but most importantly, wrote a very influential book called Schools and Slums, in which he argued after Brown v. Board that there should be zero busing out of Black urban centers. In fact, there should be a concentration to deal with what he called a veritable witch's brew of Africans and Puerto Ricans in urban centers. And instead, he said, we would base the future of the race, and this is actually interesting, the future of the race of American democracy, right? So there's still this sort of civic notion of the United States as a distinct form of life we call democratic, but one already racialized around what he called satellite cities. These were newly emerging smaller cities, he said, between 10,000 and 60,000, like Bakersfield, California, and many cities throughout Ohio, in which suburban schools were cultivating the very values the United States would need not only to survive, but to lead and outcompete Russia. What McCannell notices is that these are actually not two separate careers. That in fact, what he's arguing for is the rearrangement of American bodies based on race, such that if the United States were to engage in a counter-value nuclear conflict with Russia, the United States would be victorious because all of Russia's best and brightest were in Moscow, Leningrad, and major cities. And all of the United States' best and brightest had fled the cities as a result of the Africanization of the American city in favor of suburbs. And that meant that it was a quote unquote, a win-win solution. That the United States could wage a nuclear war with Russia, take heavy losses in the cities, and that this would, in some sense, according to McCannell, be a solution to what he thought was an intractable problem of Blackness in America. To put it a different way, nuclear strategy was premised such that if the United States did not win in a first strike, in a second strike, it would get the benefit of African-American genocide. It's hard not to think about that as being pretty vital to the way that we understand that decision, even publicly, to shift from targeting the nuclear capabilities of our adversaries to supposedly having a more balanced nuclear defense strategy between cities instead of military targets. But I think is actually quite consistent with the ways in which a kind of eugenics was built into the very logic of the use of nuclear weapons. It's not that, as we've often been told about Kahn and others, that they didn't think that nuclear weapons would have catastrophic consequences. It's that they had actually baked those catastrophic consequences into the eugenic cosmology they had of a kind of master race, right, which would go to the stars, right? That this would be part of the mutational characteristic of what I would think we could call a kind of intergalactic white supremacy. So that's sort of part one of the cosmology portion of the book. Part two is to think about what that looked like in the Russian context. And I won't be able to go into that as much, but what's fascinating is that many of the Russian scientists working on the nuclear program, and certainly the generation of Russian scientists after the nuclear program, had a similar kind of nuclear futurism. It was also highly eugenic. They built so-called plutonium cities, which were model cities that were meant to survive a nuclear conflict, but not just survive, thrive. It came with its own system of sort of art, aesthetics, and literature around sort of new kinds of Soviet humans, which would, if not be resilient to radiation, would actually kind of thrive on it. Anya Bernstein has done an amazing job showing how these early, what were called Russian cosmists, who believed in this sort of accelerationist or futurist vision of going out into the stars and bringing a kind of new species with it. The current in Russia concepts of immortality and singularity, and the new futurism, which is often present in a lot of the neo-authoritarianism of the nuclear movements under Putin. Boris Groys has also done a great job of showing how sort of widespread this notion of Russian cosmism and this kind of intergalactic vision of communism was during the Soviet period. And I think when we take those two things together, then something really interesting happens. This is where I'll sort of end the talk, which is not only do we see that there isn't a rationality underlying the logic of nuclear weapons, there is this kind of full-blooded and full-throated eugenic cosmology for the remaking of a human species around a mutated and in some sense victorious potential national race, either white in the US case or Russian in the Russian case. But there is this like fascinating way in which we have to rework Bill Connelly's notion of the capitalism evangelical resonance machine to think about an American-Russian nuclear resonance machine. The ways in which it wasn't sort of competing game theorists or competing mathematicians or the kind of vision we have of competing computer models on how the nuclear weapons would win or lose, such that we would always win to a stalemate, right? That vision we have from war games in which there is no victory possible, but one in which on both sides, even limited victories, right? Meaning just their form of life continued, even in a sort of, radioactive wasteland, could be in some sense the victory for the species, right? The very thing that would allow a new species to enter into outer space and continue out into an interstellar future. And then the ways in which these obviously feed off one another. It's impossible to think about the kinds of nationalist sort of inspirations that we see in neo-Eurasianism in Russia that have made the nuclear weapons sacred again, and much in the same spirit of the Russian cosmos, without the sort of countervailing version of the United States with the new nationalists we see with the rise of white supremacists who have an internationalist vision of white supremacy. This is Bannon, this is Miller. These are the sort of visions of a transformative world in which it's not nuclear capability, but nuclear superiority, which is essential. And where we would like to end the book is to think about the ways in which these are sort of mimetically shaping one another. Why the nuclear renaissance isn't just a renaissance in technology or just a kind of increase in popularity of nuclear warfighting again, but along with it, a real belief that nuclear warfighting is possible, not because nuclear weapons can in some sense not be used because we can win, meaning we show our capability and therefore no one's crazy enough to use them, but precisely we should try to use them and win because we will use them at some point in time. And the relative gains of a few survivors, if done right, means the kind of transformation of the species, or a kind of nuclear messianism, which again is not an evacuation of the secular into the spiritual, but is a full immanentization, right? A making immanent of a kind of trans-historical futurist species transformation, which would be something like a messianic moment, but here on Earth and in the stars. So I'll leave it there, and then hopefully people have lots of questions. Thanks.
Oh man, I have like 3 pages of notes, Jairus. So I'm actually really glad that there are already a couple questions in the Q&A, so I can gather my thoughts a little bit. But first of all, thank you for offering that. I'm super excited for where your project will take you and your colleague, and looking forward to reading some of this. So Krishna has asked, or submitted a question saying, in the 1950s, nuclear annihilation was taken very seriously in the US and elsewhere. Back then, climate change, global warming, and other issues didn't exist. To what extent is contemporary nuclear indifference a part of an overall extinction fatigue? a sense of we're doomed anyway. What difference does it make which method offs us all?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Krishna. That was sort of the Falk and Lipton position in the late 80s, that we had entered something that they called nuclear numbing, that we couldn't really conceive of the scale of nuclear destruction. And so it was easier to just be indifferent to it than to take it seriously. I mean, I think that there's obviously truth to that. And I think particularly in the context of COVID and climate change and, organic only buffalo hat fascists taking the Capitol, right? Like it's easy to see why there would be fatigue. But like, as well as I, that like there's anything but extinction fatigue at the ISA, and there's anything but extinction fatigue amongst policy experts. What's amazing is this incredible, and that's why we want to call it sort of rationalist providentialism, right? This sense of providence, that actually the reason why we don't need to worry about nuclear weapons is that they're regulated by reason. They're regulated by rationality. And as a result, deterrence will be incredibly stable, right? That sort of long shadow of Kenneth Waltz is still very much, I think, how a lot of people sleep at night. And part of that too is an assumption, which I think now is, at least there are cracks in, that no one would reach the level of power of the American presidency that would ever stray outside or color outside the lines of rationality. And even though, finally, supposedly we're done with Trump, I mean, it's telling, like, it's not like Biden's had a big rollout of reversing the nuclear modernization that Trump started. And for all of Obama's supposed time that he spent writing about nuclear disarmament as a college student, we didn't see an aggressive, anti-nuclear strategy during the Obama administration. And so, I think, sure, I think fatigue is part of it. But what's amazing is, I think, as crazy as the cosmological investment is in the transformative capability of nuclear weapons, we have a parallel cosmological, full-on religious and evangelical investment in the stability of rational order. And both of them, in some sense, have a belief in an unbreakable world, right? Where things can't go that wrong. I think that's kind of where the project turns critically. I mean, I think at another level, it's just, we're really interested in the fact that we haven't taken seriously that there was a kind of a nuclear philosophical movement in Russia and the United States, which was highly developed, had a metaphysics, had an epistemology, thought about its relationship to science, thought about its relationship to racism and eugenics explicitly, right? Like there is and we don't take it seriously because it's not in a philosophy textbook. And yet these are the people who are making major choices for the 20th century and determining who would get experimented upon, right? So that sort of, that view of the entire human population as something that could be a laboratory for not just nuclear weapons, but now, I mean, pick your poison, right? Toxins, anything else. That kind of vision of humanity is something that could be altered biologically, right? As part of a series of political choices. That's a very, very powerful and dangerous idea, something that Foucault would call biopower, but it's something I think more dramatic than even Foucault imagined, and is at the heart of the way that cybernetics enters into politics, the way that genetics and synthetic biology enter into politics. And I think, to understand, right, we really have to kind of get at that moment where, everyone was real excited because they blew a really big thing up.
So, I'm really interested, Jairus, in the way that you talked briefly last month, actually, about U.S. response to COVID-19, and hearing you talk about this kind of win-win eugenics, nuclear thought kind of thing with James Conan and nuclear strategy. I'm curious if, based on your own research, how much you think really this thinking is continuing to influence current kind of nuclear thinking, but also is this really the same kind of narrative, this kind of win-win racial eugenics ideology behind our response to climate change, COVID-19, or is there a sense of, I don't know, I'm just like curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah. at a very minimum, they all bear a family resemblance. So it's, I don't know, it starts to become almost conspiracy theory when you just like connect the dots until you look at someone like Teller, who's literally the like smoking man in the back of the room of the X-Files, like at every historical period. But I do think it's impossible not to see how politics at the scale of the nation state, when thought about in the logic of a settler state, doesn't inevitably become a series of eugenic decisions. Meaning, once a state is already privileged on the idea that there is a class of people for whom matter more, right? They're either because, and they vary, right? This extreme white supremacist version is they matter more because they're chosen by God, or they matter more because they're a pure race, all the way down to the more rationalized neoliberal version. They matter more because they're the engines of the economy, or they matter more because they're the source of creativity and invention that makes America run, right?
Yeah.
But then choices get made. And I think what's important, and part of the reason why it's so significant in the nuclear case is also why it's significant in the COVID case, it's not an accident that only 5% of African Americans have received vaccines, right? Or rather, only 5% of vaccines have gone to African Americans, even though they've borne an unbelievable percentage of the fatalities, right?
Yeah.
And those choices will get rationalized in particular ways. One, they weren't frontline workers in a way that frontline workers were determined to be frontline, or, oh, well, information just didn't get out to them, or they were in dense urban centers where we couldn't get access as easily, but like when you start realizing how much of those alibis were engineered into the system precisely as a kind of strategic conceit, right? That we actually have a strategic geography to the United States. We don't just have a racial geography, we have a strategic geography, and it's underwritten by race politics. So that, honestly, there's a reason why when we talk about, sort of deterrent strategies with Korea, that North Korea striking California is the kind of red line, not if they strike Guam or Hawaii. Right, that these islands are maintained precisely because of the strategic value of having something which will hurt, but will not hurt as much, right? So it's not that it's zero value, it's that the value is relative, and that relative value, like the escalation ladder, where you have different sizes of nuclear weapons, you have different sizes of sacrifices and losses and values, and as a result, right, you have more strategic flexibility. So the Marshall Islands have zero value. You can just move the people and nuke the island, and then that expands outward, right? And there are all these kinds of modulations, and I think the same thing is true for COVID as well. And where it becomes really explicit is you read, and I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but you read the manifestos of people like the El Paso shooter, or a lot of the Boogaloos, or other kind of right-wing accelerationists, and they talk about these things explicitly. That COVID is an opportunity, that war is an opportunity, that climate change and the catastrophes it will bring will finally be the opportunity for the United States to lock down its borders and concentrate on rebuilding its race and changing the demographics of the world, right? So that is not a casual nor rare form of thinking. That kind of accelerationist approach, which has eugenics in tandem with the agency provided by science and politicized through authoritarianism, right? That triumvirate is actually a really powerful argument, and a really powerful political movement, which we're willing to write off the ones who wear Hawaiian shirts and call themselves Boogaloos, but that's Bannon's position, and that guy is like, he was in the White House, and I think that you see that in Putin as well, and we've left China out of the story a bit for mostly practical reasons, but they just also don't have nearly as many nuclear weapons. It's not even close. But that logic is not a rare logic, and so it's worth, I think, taking seriously.
There are so many questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you're looking at these too. I don't want to just throw the ones that I think are most interesting. If there's any
No, you should. I can't see them very well. So
fine. I will just go in the order that they're appearing then.
Yeah.
Okay, so Paul is asking, how do the American and Russian perspectives discussed mirror or differ from the perspectives employed by other nuclear powers, specifically the smaller nations who have made conscious decisions to join the nuclear power club later, despite the threat of global condemnation, i.e. Israel? Presumably the interests of these nations that were advanced by nuclear weapons are different, given their greater risks of annihilation by neighboring non-nuclear armed powers.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a really good question. You know, it's, I mean, one of the things about the way that George W. Bush both broke all the norms and sort of redefined the norms for US intervention in states, meaning the sort of preemptive doctrine that we could hit first because of the sort of existential risk a state was as a state, combined with nuclear modernization, and a total disregard for nuclear disarmament or control, means that we send a signal to the entire planet. If you didn't want to become Iraq, you better get a nuclear weapon fast, right? Because Bush said there was an axis of evil, and it was Iraq, it was Iran, and it was North Korea. At times he flirted with Cuba, but no one took that seriously. But here's the thing, he was going to invade all three, right? And as soon as Iran could say, well, we could have a nuclear weapon pretty fast, and as soon as North Korea said, well, we already have one, then it became about not invasion, it became about airstrikes, and the airstrikes became questionable. And so it's certainly the case the United States has educated the world that if you don't want the United States to entirely disregard your sovereignty, you better have a nuclear weapon or be totally subservient to the United States and therefore not be sovereign, right? And I think, you know, whether or not we think those policies reversed after Bush, once that's been demonstrated, then every country in the world has to make their decisions based on the personality of each president. And that's actually not democracy, right? It's certainly not a democratic order at the international level, but it's the definition of monarchy, right? If a king or queen is good or bad, then becomes about their personality and not about the institution, right? So the institution of international law left in shambles, nuclear weapons. So there's definitely a good incentive to have nuclear weapons, which is totally irrational. And I think North Korea falls into that camp. However, nuclear weapons have completely altered the way in which North Korea represents to themselves and to the world their future. Whether or not it's building tons of underground cities and mobilizing the population around the capacity of nuclear weapons, the fact that they're constantly exposing their citizens to radiation because of the unsafe nuclear tests, the fact that so much of North Korean futurism is premised around this idea of becoming a kind of like nuclear citizen, right? If it didn't start that way, it certainly is going that way. And I think similarly, like you look at India and Pakistan, and particularly the Indian bomb, and how caught up in Indian nationalism the bomb is. And while the close proximity to Pakistan makes it harder to talk in public about first strikes in exactly the same way, I think it can't help but go there, right? China, similarly, I think, it's really hard not to see nuclear weapons entering into it. When I was in Shanghai, I couldn't sleep because I was like jet lagged or whatever. And at midnight, like you're watching Chinese TV, and Chinese TV is awesome. Mostly because of which American movies they choose, which are almost all from the 80s, which is great. Like I'll watch Flatliners dubbed in Chinese, that's fine. But also there would be these like 30-minute breaks in between movies where they would show a reenactment of a Chinese nuclear strike on the United States. And it was, the dramaturgy of it was just fascinating. It was like you could hear whatever Chinese version of From Sea to Shining Sea is, right? Like they would show every region of China, and there'd be people rushing to either get nuclear weapons out of silos or get them on trucks or get them in the air. And then the thing ended with all the nuclear weapons, going erect, to pre-script Kathy's question about Carol Cohn, and then blast off, right? And then, the explosions. And there's a tendency in critical IR to only read these things symbolically, like to read them representationally, right? That it's just the discourse of the weapons, but it really is the lived experience of what kinds of risks you're willing to take with the population. And I think that's impossible to separate from the racial politics of wiping out Uyghurs and concentrating a certain notion of Chineseness, which is, I think, comparable to a notion of whiteness, and the ways in which it's expanded in Africa, and it's expanding into the Pacific, and the way in which Pacific Islanders are already being put to a choice between cheaper Chinese development funds versus US development funds, and what that means for the way that Xi in particular projects a certain kind of Chinese cosmology into outer space, right? And that goes all the way back to Mao. And if either Antoine or I read Chinese, or there were more texts available in English, I think that would, like there are in Russia, there's just a lot of English translations. It would be hard to ignore the fact that Mao, when he had only he had like 2 nuclear weapons, he said the United States will never strike us because they know they can't get all of us. But the interesting thing is that Mao said something follow-up that was even more profound. He said, and truly, from the perspective of a star, what is a single or even 100 nuclear detonations? And like part of that is like, that's like the most like raw thing you could say in a fight. Like, I don't even care, you know? But we could also take seriously that there was a perspective there that somehow that was inconsequential in the grand scale of history and cosmology that he was thinking of. So I don't think that we can leave it out, I guess is a good way of putting it.
Word. Well, since you actually hinted at Kathy's question,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking a lot about this too, in particular, you know, when you read the work of Teresia Teaiwa, she talks about in Micronesia, they would dig these trenches and name them after women, right? And then they'd name the bombs after men. So there's this like gendered. Anyway, I'll read Kathy's question. She says, as you initially spoke about your encounter in a bar in Prague, I thought of Carol Cohn's note in Sex and Defense in the Rational World of Defense Nuclear Intellectuals, where she reflects on her time in war planning think tank. Reader, she said, I liked them. In your thinking, do you find continuing use for her sex/gender analysis of nuclear reason?
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, Carol was part of the collective that wrote Nuclear Fallacies. And I think that book is incredibly powerful, in particular in understanding how the generation that inherited the weapons came to eroticize the weapons, meaning to literally derive power and erotics from the capacity of nuclear weapons. So my favorite phrase in Carol's old essay is that one of the generals giving the talk said that when it goes off, it's an orgasmic whoomp. That was literally the phrase. And I think that that's present. My concern, and the reason why I think we're doing something somewhat different, and this will seem kind of creepy, is that after you read Nuclear Fallacies, what you come away with is this is just like patriarchy gone totally insane, right? You know what I mean? Like it's just testosterone soaked rape culture with nuclear weapons. It is that for sure. What's remarkable to me is that such a incredibly highly developed and reasoned, not rational, but reasoned cosmology built the weapons before that went wild. So I think those are actually slightly different. So it's useful to understand the way in which someone could become erotically attached to death, right? Which is sort of the explanation in Cohn, right? This is basically Freud's death drive, right? You sexualize the weapons precisely in the way that you resolve the tension between the reality principle and the death drive. And that it particularly in patriarchy doesn't come out as care or compassion, it comes out as rape and domination. What's remarkable to me is that the thinkers like von Braun and a lot of the Russian cosmists, they were not afraid of dying. What they saw in nuclear power was the generative capacity to emancipate life. And I do think that is a different political economy of desire from the erotics of death and domination, which is not to say that it wasn't racist and it wasn't patriarchal, but the circulation is just totally different. So it's not about how cool the destruction is, it's actually about how cool the creation is. And this gets back to the question that Hildra asked, and that maybe Akaika was asking too, about things like Project Pluto and Project Orion, where they wanted to use nuclear weapons to literally power spaceships. And I think the way that we've historicized that in the past is to say, oh, well, isn't that great? That's turning swords into plowshares, right? So that was sort of the peaceful side of nuclear weapons, and the destructive side was blowing things up. And what I want to say is that actually there is a huge continuity here, that the destruction is part of the creation, whether it's because of racial cleansing or it's because of jump-starting mutations in the human species because we needed to start evolving this kind of neo-Darwinian sort of statecraft, or it's this sort of capacity to literally change and terraform planets through destruction. I don't think that there's a clear difference. And Sam Cooley's point about Musk, I mean, Musk falls into this category, right? Musk owns, as he said, 25% of the satellite capability, but he also, they talk about using nuclear weapons to help terraform Mars because it's a way to start creating an artificial atmosphere. Because you need to throw the dust up in the atmosphere to reflect some of the UV radiation so that there can be some stability in the planet. So think about Grimes, who's Elon Musk's wife, talking about how she's willing to be an indentured servant. Basically, she described herself as a slave on Mars. And the reason why is because she doesn't think it'll last forever, because she says Elon has agreed to give her a singularity suit so that she can upload her consciousnness into a robot body and live forever, right? So these notions of immortality and these notions of transformation, that's certainly not patriarchy, but it's not the patriarchy of like auto annihilation. It's like this very strange, generative, like emancipatory vision of patriarchy, which I think is creepy in a different way. So
yeah, it's not lost on me in the way that you discuss the lack of extinction, transformation kind of argument, that it seems pretty clear as I'm listening to these things that immortality is a reality reserved for white folks, right? Like there are certain people and things that are outside of the bounds of that cosmology. Okay, so Craig, because we only have time for a few more questions. Craig Santos Perez is asking, given the development of nuclearism during the rise of Nazism and thinking about the current rise of fascism around the world, can you talk about the relationship between nuclear logic and anti-fascism? And two, given the fall of communism, can you talk a bit about the relationship between nuclearism and capitalism?
Yeah. Those are great questions, and things that I'll talk about in the book, but I just couldn't get to in the talk. In particular, I mean, the kinds of futurism which came out of Italy, which were proto versions of fascism in the 10s and 20s and 30s, which really saw war as how we would mobilize the bodies of humans to become greater, right? That the Ubermensch, the Overman, the Superman would emerge from the battlefield or would emerge from these highly technological environments. Which then comes to inspire a lot of the writing that goes into fascism, both in Italy and in Germany. Because I think one of the things that you see, we like to characterize fascism around its racism because that's the thing that disgusts us most. But the reality is that a lot of that racism is generated around a will to sort of like intensification, right? So, and you even see this amongst the Proud Boys who are really into fascism, right? What do they want to do? Why are they Proud Boy members? Well, they want to beat the crap out of each other, to train each other so that then they can get into fights. And that isn't just to pursue a political ends, it's actually in and of itself, right? Like that they're gonna become real men because they've seen the limits of their own body, right? It's like Fight Club. Well, it's just Fight Club. So, go watch the movie, everybody. Sadly, it's become, the handbook for the right. But it was actually a really important part of Nazi eugenics too, right? So gymnastics, German gymnastics, the idea of the improvement of the body, bodybuilding. In fact, the first uses of crystal meth in warfare to sort of like speed up the body, intensify it, not be able to sleep, be able to fight all night long, right? These ideas of the body becoming something else or transformation is actually at the heart of fascism. And so we tend to interpret fascism as a conservatism, but it's a revolutionary transformationism. It's just one that's super evil and horrifying. I think nuclear weapons come out of that. Right, I think that the idea that you can transform any bit of matter into a self-sustaining chain reaction or explosion, which will consume things, and then that also gives you the capacity to create limitless energy or limitless warfare or limitless space travel. That kind of mobilization of the earth is a fascist eco-politics. It's not an eco-politics. It is very much an engagement with matter, with earth, with nature, but it is a kind of mobilization of nature and man, because it was incredibly patriarchal, although there are some really interesting gendered versions of it, to, right, like take on, you know, what's next. Which raises the really interesting question about whether or not, you know, so I do think that by definition, anti-nuclearism is anti-fascism, and I think all anti-fascism has to be anti-nuclearism, full stop. The capitalism question is really interesting, because what we'd like to think as good lefties is that somehow this type of fascism and this type of nuclearism is somehow endemic to capital, but it really isn't. It's endemic to Western modernity. And Marxism is as much a product of Western modernity as capitalism is. It's transformational. I mean, look at the way that Russia treated third world countries and often thought about the transformation of economies and so-called agrarian societies. I mean, there's some changes with Maoism, but, you know, like Russia pre-fall is not somehow the friend of indigenous people or agrarian people. It sees them maybe as something that can be incorporated, but it just means it has a logic of extermination by homogenization rather than a logic of extermination by extermination. It's one in which transformation is the highest order and goal. So, you know, it's not surprising then that China or Russia could have that pre-capital and could have that in their weird new combination. And I don't actually think capitalism describes either China or Russia very well. The fall of communism in both is not therefore capitalism. It's this new kind of, you know, immanentized but transformative authoritarianism, where they want to make a new race and they want to make a new species and they want that species to take over the entire continent. And they see technology and immortality and a lot of other sort of transformational tools as being essentially part of that characteristic. And so for me, fascism is more the enemy than capitalism, not because I don't want to take down capitalism too, but because the reality is that most of the early nuclear scientists, even though they said they were trying to preserve, you know, the free market or entrepreneurialism, have been just as willing to ditch the market in favor of authoritarianism. And we see that with people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, right? They're all for the free market right up until they want to go to Mars. And then when they describe Mars, it's just full-scale command and control authoritarianism. Or they just back Trump because they think Trump will be more disruptive. So I think capitalism is sort of like, it's late to the party, you know, and can be pretty easily dismissed. So.
Wonderful. We have just a few minutes left, and one of the things you talked a lot about today and with your project is kind of this track that we're on and historicizing kind of nuclear thought, where we're headed now based on that history. And I've heard you discuss in other places, a discussion of like plausible futures, right? When looking at a problem, here are like a few possible futures. So I'm curious, and I think this gets at some other people's questions too. In your mind, where do we go from here? Is this a question that's interesting in your project? Is this a question that's interesting to you? Like in recognition of all the nuclear buildup and these cosmologies, things that have already happened, what are some potential futures? Is there a future beyond our nuclear present? Is there a future where we have such great nuclear defense systems that we actually slow the production of nuclear weapons? Or are we just on this road in which we continue to, this escalation is inevitable? Yeah.
It's a great question. Yeah, and there are a bunch of questions like Mitch asked about like ASATs and ABMs, and Boyd asked about Russian, you know, space expansion, and Hui is as well asking about China. You know, I think that space is never going to pan out to be as cool as we hoped it would be. And I think that's probably true in every possible future. But I do think that the nuclear renaissance is in a resonance relationship with the contemporary expansion of outer space. So it's impossible not to see, in some sense, confidence in using nuclear weapons with a confidence that one side or the other will dominate the space terrain. And what we're actually seeing in practice is exactly the opposite. It's becoming so fragile, right? All of the satellites in your Earth orbit, no one's got something out to something like a Lagrange point where you could have like a high ground in outer space because you were, you know, in the sort of gravity well, and, you know, you could control everything. So I think we're likely to see a lot of disruption. And if that disruption doesn't actually end up causing nuclear war by accident, it could transform what more and more people think is feasible. You know, there were actually a lot of people who used to believe that it would be good if there were a limited nuclear war, because it would so significantly scare the hell out of everybody that we would stop doing it. I don't really believe that. I actually think that, you know, I mean, COVID's a great example. It's amazing how quickly we can adapt to horrible things and be like, oh no, it's cool. What's 500,000 people more or less? You know, like that's literally, that's where we are right now in the United States, right? Half the country supports Trump, and it's sad he left, and is okay with the fact that 500,000 people were killed by Trump's policies, and they were American citizens, and that just doesn't matter. Right? And part of that is racialization, but part of that is also just like a particular casualness with human life. So, I mean, the thing that I always like to tell people about potential futures is never count out what people can normalize and can come to accept. Now, you know, just so that it's not all awful, like where could it go better? Where could it become more interesting? You know, I mean, I think I could imagine a world where the incapacity of great states gives way to internal collapse, right? Like, I don't think we're so far away from an American Civil War. I definitely don't think China is far from a civil war. I definitely don't think Russia is far from a civil war. And while that sounds horrifying and scary, I can imagine a world where even the idea of great powers, right? So the kinds of capacities to wage these kinds of horrific systems become not obsolete, but incredibly difficult to mobilize people around. And I don't think those will all be good outcomes, but I also think that could be really beneficial. You know, like I think if we had to rethink what we thought the state could be and what we thought the state could do, and how many of us could be contained within it, and how much difference it was supposed to contain, or whether or not, you know, having one race was a particularly good idea. You know, I think the calamities this kind of thinking will befall will create the opposite. Now, whether or not that opposite survives, I wish I could say, you know, like, I don't know. But what I do know, and this is something I would like to sort of like maybe in the talk on a bit, and it is the kind of the normative motivation behind the book. Most of the book's motivated by the weird, perverse curiosity I have for how horrible white people really are. And why it wasn't just an accident, and it wasn't just a historical period we got over. It's like actually at the heart of these institutions at some level. And if we don't want it to be, then we have to address the heart of these institutions. And I think that's, for me, like, that's the political task, which is to stop historicizing and saying, well, that's what we were. And instead say, well, actually, this is what we are. And if we don't like what that is, then that actually has to change, right? We need different cosmologies. And I think a big part of American liberalism for sure, but I think statecraft in general, was about saying that states didn't have to operate at the level of cosmology. We could leave cosmology behind because the Enlightenment had left it behind, and reason and rationality would be enough to bond politics together. And that's just bullshit. And the line that we like to draw, that like moderns are the ones that don't need cosmology, and it's the crazy non-moderns who are still running around believing in it, that's just false, right? We all have cosmologies. And the problem is that some of those cosmologies literally want to destroy the planet and turn it into a spaceship for white people. And if that's not what we want, then we better start finding how to create new kinds of cosmologies that don't end in those things. And that's why people like, you know, Marisol del Cadena, you know, and her notion of pluriverse, like wanting to proliferate the number of cosmologies is so important, right? We need more cosmologies at the level of explicit political debate. And, you know, like, to respond to my friend on Facebook who was like, oh, why aren't you talking about the good cosmologies? Well, the good cosmologies can talk about themselves. I don't come from a tradition of good cosmologies. They don't need me to narrate them, right? That's, you know, as you become a superstar actor, that's your job, Haley. Like, but I do think that until we start taking seriously that there are actually cosmologies that work in American politics, then playing around at the edges of policy making will do very little to alter these trajectories. And the best example of that is the fact that we've had so little change in the last 60 years over presidential war-making authority between Democrats and Republicans. They've all expanded it for the president, right? So for like 2 seconds, we wanted to take away nuclear authority from the president when it was Trump. And now that conversation has disappeared now that it's Biden. But like, you know, it'll be Trump again. and it's Biden, you know, like who knows, you know, like, right? So until we realize that that isn't just a question of like better procedure, better laws, you know, better sort of institutions, but the cosmologies that inhabit those institutions and the settler colonial present that underwrites the systems of value and judgment for determining which lives succeed and which lives fail or which lives die, then I think we're at a political impasse. And so for me, that means that we have to have a cosmology conversation, and I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. But you know, the fact that we have people running around thinking nuking the world would be good makes me uncomfortable. So there, start talking about it. You know, that whole thing, like, you know, you don't want to bring religion into politics. Like, religion's here, and it's, you know, evangelical patriots, and it's really, you know, kind of thought-provoking, peace-committed Quakers and Catholics sometimes, or it's crazy authoritarian Quakers and Catholics, and it's also scientists, right? It's nuclear scientists, right? That is a cosmology too. And until all of those are kind of on the same playing field, I don't think we're going to have an honest or even possible fight. So that's what I'll.
Oh man, thank you. I'm not even going to try to come up with something really smart to say after all that you just offered us. I just want to thank you for a really wonderful presentation. I know I learned a lot. I know I'm not the only person who was just like nodding along and humming and hawing the whole time. So I want to mahalo you for joining us. I want to mahalo everyone who signed in to listen. If you need to watch this again, because I will probably watch it again, it will be up on our YouTube channel in the coming days. Let me find that link for y'all. So go over there.
Sorry, and real quick, if I didn't get to your question because I couldn't see it in the Q&A, email me your question. I hate that these talks don't end with us going out to dinner and like all hanging out and talking and like finishing the conversation. So please, if you didn't get your question answered, email it to me so we can finish the conversation.
Yes, please. Yes. Yeah, that is all I have. Mahalo for helping us keep our community alive, our intellectual community alive, even though we're virtual, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next one. Thank you, Jairus.
Hi, everybody.